Honestly, man, if you took a time machine back into July, I guess, and you told me that by the time October 23rd rolled around, the NHL would be in a position where Matt Dumba has no interest from a lot of these teams that need defensemen, I would have been like, what? Are you serious? Today we're talking about an article posted onto The Athletic. This is by Michael Russo. As always, a link will be in the description to this article. But because The Athletic is paid for material, we're going over onto Spectre's Hockey. This is their article from October 22nd, and it talks about what Russo says in his Athletic article. The main idea of this video centers around Matt Dumba, 26-year-old right-handed defenseman, 6 feet tall, 183 pounds on the Minnesota Wild, who is being paid $6 million a season until 2023. However, he's in a position where today he does not have that modified no-trade clause that kicks in a year. He's a guy who has been on the trading block, according to various sources around the league, during various times over the past few months. He's been on the block, and it's been very evident, according to all the trade rumors, all the ideas that people were tossing around in there. But Michael Russo's recent article on The Athletic kind of goes over the contrary as to what exactly the interest seems to be from his perspective around the NHL and its Canadian teams mostly. So let's go over onto Spectre's Hockey and talk about what is said from Michael Russo's perspective. Russo was asked when he thought Minnesota Wild D-man Matt Dumba would be traded. He believes that will happen whenever Wild GM Bill Guerin gets the return he wants. However, money is tight around the league, and he doesn't see a Dumba trade happening anytime soon. First and foremost, the Wild are in a spot where, hey, Matt Dumba is one of the only defenders they have that does not have that no-trade clause intact just yet. They have some pretty okay defensemen, but what they really want is a second-line center. That was pushed even further when Mikko Koivu left. Now they're in a position where they gave up Eric Staal, so you could say that the Minnesota Wild need a lot of things, which is why a guy like Matt Dumba has been tossed into these trade rumors over the past few months. Russo felt the Vancouver Canucks were not really interested in Matt Dumba, and he doesn't feel the Wild were interested in Calgary Flames center Sean Monahan. He doesn't see Dumba getting shipped to the Winnipeg Jets because they don't have the centers that the Wild could want. The Ottawa Senators also were not interested, while the Toronto Maple Leafs moved on once they knew they weren't getting Alex Pietrangelo. Now that's interesting to me. First and foremost, this sentence right here. The Maple Leafs moved on from Dumba once they knew they were not getting Pietrangelo. Are you implying the idea that Toronto wanted, in an ideal world where things went their way, was a decor of both Dumba and Pietrangelo? Oh man, talk about revamping your right side completely. The next sentence talks about how Russo believes a trade with the Florida Panthers could actually happen, contrary to the idea that he said about all the other teams about how those trades are probably not going to happen. So let's go over each of these teams right here and talk about their connections to the whole Matt Dumba trade story, and we'll start off with the Vancouver Canucks, because the Canucks are in a weird spot where there have been a lot of Minnesota Wild trade rumors with the Vancouver Canucks over the past year and a half, I guess, maybe 2 years. And it's because the Vancouver Canucks have Brock Besser, who is a Minnesota homegrown talent. He was the guy whom the Minnesota Wild passed over at the 2015 NHL entry draft. They took Joel Eriksson instead, which is a good pick, especially for the spot they took him at. But a few picks after went Brock Besser, the Burnsville, Minnesota native, who eventually became a Vancouver Canucks cult star. Over the past year and a little bit, it's been noted by many media reports that the Minnesota Wild have been very, very adamant on trying to go after this guy. And because of the whole Dumba rumors that went around where Dumba was being shopped, and the Vancouver Canucks' uncertainties with their right side on defense, with Tanev and Stetcher and all these guys maybe leaving, spoiler alert, they did indeed leave, and it makes me upset. Everybody was like, okay, let's connect the two. Besser, Dumba. We made a video about that. And yeah, no, it didn't happen. If what Russo is saying here is correct, that the Vancouver Canucks just really were not interested in Dumba, then you know it makes sense to me, man. Dumba, as we mentioned off the top, $6 million cap hit for the next 3 years, and the latter 2 of those years have a modified no-trade clause. You think the Vancouver Canucks are in cap problems right now? Man, imagine if they had Dumba. Now you could say, okay, but if they traded away Besser for Dumba, then it would be okay, right? Well, I get that, but The Canucks were so adamant on not trading Brock Besser, even to the point that they straight up rejected a Besser for Zucker idea that happened a year and something ago, that I don't know if they would have been able to do it. And when it comes to the other pieces that the Vancouver Canucks could have moved in order to free up cap space, Sutter, Beagle, Roussel, all these guys that we talk about day after day, you're not accepting that if you're Minnesota. You want a second-line center, not Brandon Sutter. So, at the end of the day, Vancouver not being interested makes complete sense to me. Let's move over onto the next team. It is here mentioned as Sean Monahan and the Calgary Flames. If the Wild were not interested in Sean Monahan, then honestly, that's kind of weird. Like, straight up. That's pretty weird, in my opinion. Sean Monahan, in my opinion, is indeed a pretty good NHL forward, and if you have him as your second-line center, I think you're probably doing something right. I get that Sean Monahan, in this context and in the way that I'm speaking about him, is being carried more by reputation than recent performance, because his most recent season saw him put up 48 points in 70 games played, which is following a season where he was a point per game. So obviously there was a big drop-off there. But in the postseason, Monahan was good. 8 points, 10 games played. This guy was honestly pretty solid in point production, and we've been seeing a lot of Calgary Flames fans talking about the idea of trading a Monahan or a Gaudreau because these guys have not been able to put this team out of the first round. Monahan, though, is making $6.375 million a season until 2023, and he does have a modified no-trade clause starting this season. Honestly, I'm trying to think of a reason as to why the Minnesota Wild would not want Sean Monahan if Dumba is a guy they want to move, and if Sean Monahan is a center who fills what they need, unless you're just talking straight up about, oh, Monahan was disappointing this season, therefore the Wild don't want him. Other than that, if you take a look at all of his body of work before this previous season, I'd probably say it's a good bet if the Wild were out here chasing a Sean Monahan to be their number one center, or maybe even their number two, depending on what happens going into the long term. Hey, if you have Marco Rossi as your number one center, you have Monahan as your second line center, and then you have Marat Kuznetsov as your third line center. That is amazing. I've been saying it for years, man. The Minnesota Wild have themselves some very good prospects. But this conversation right here, it's kind of difficult to understand. Next up, though, the Winnipeg Jets. Hey, they don't have the centers that the Minnesota Wild would want. Hey, they got Paul Stastny recently in the trade, but there's no way they're trading away that guy to get Matt Dumba, because they just traded for that guy, and that guy was the guy who many people were like, yeah, this guy could probably help out Patrick Laine and wanting to stay in Winnipeg, but unfortunately it doesn't really seem like that's happening. Next up, though, it is the Ottawa Senators. The Senators were not interested. That's just what it says straight up. Yeah, I mean, they're a rebuilding team, they're a young team, they're getting youthful. Dumba isn't necessarily old, but if you're giving up what exactly it is the Minnesota Wild want, a nice second-line center or whatever, you're giving up Jean-Gabriel Pageau, who is not on the team anymore, or you're touching some of your youth into the future. A guy like Colin White or whatever. I mean, not gonna say that he's a second-line center or whatever, but like, there's a reason to understand why the Senators, who are in a different position timeline-wise, would not want to do this. Finally, though, it's the Toronto Maple Leafs. We talked about this one. It's kind of weird how they were not interested once they realized they were not involved in the Pietrangelo sweepstakes anymore. That was kind of weird. But then we do have the Florida Panthers that are indeed mentioned as a team. The Florida Panthers might indeed actually go for it. And it's actually kind of interesting because if you take a look at the Florida Panthers and their whole situation going on defense, right now, at the time of this recording, they have Mackenzie Weegar, who's a right-handed shot. He's unsigned, and there have been quite the rumors going around talking about how he is disappointed or whatever with contract negotiations. It's a weird story going on in Florida and Mackenzie Weegar, so if indeed a Dumba does concern them, they do have themselves what I would say is a pretty nice core of centers. Obviously, you have that Alexander Barkov, who is the number one, but behind him, you had Trocheck last year. He's gone, unfortunately. You have Vetrano, who was there as well. You have yourselves some players. I mean, hey, this Minnesota Wild team is the team that accepted Marcus Johansson for Eric Stahl, so I think a lot of things out there can indeed get this one done. But I just don't really know the certainty of that. So we'll see what exactly goes on with these trade negotiations, if Dumba even is traded. Of course, Russo did say it in the article that the only reason the Wild would even accept a trade is because they feel like they're actually getting fair value back, and they're making a trade that improves their team rather than decreases from it. That's the same philosophy taken from the video we did a few days ago talking about Patrick Laine. But I want you to tell me in the comments what you think about this whole idea, how the Vancouver Canucks, the Flames, the Leafs, the Jets, and the Senators are not interested in Dumba, which coincidentally are 5 out of the 7 Canadian teams. Talk to me in the comments if you think you enjoyed this video. That was 99, and bye.